And we're in heaven, by the way. Maybe you didn't notice, but we're in heaven, and we live in this white heavenly realm now. So it's very pleasurable.
Yes.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to read this as an essay. I wrote it as an essay because I didn't want to miss any of the essential parts. So here we go. Among the various differences between female and male, or feminine and masculine sexual psychology, perhaps the most fundamental is that female or feminine sexual psychology is far more hidden. The young girl learns to hide her sexual self. There's a variety of reasons for this. Socially, her social conditioning devalues and fears feminine sexuality for a variety of reasons. We can summarize this by saying, quote, letting the cat out of the bag, if you know what I mean, end quote, disrupts social norms, right? That energy disrupts social norms. That's a lot of energy, right? We talked about that during the meditation. Now, that larger topic of social influences on female sexual psychology, it's really beyond the scope of our topic tonight. But I think that's something that in today's day and age, most of us are familiar with. And it has a very, it has a big impact, but it impacts her psychologically as well. So we're going to focus more on the immediate direct impact. Even the social circumstances impact the psychology. So the psychology is, in a sense, the greater impact. It's more immediate. The social influences go through the psychology. So we're going to really focus on the psychological impacts. As the little girl develops psychologically, a split develops between a sexual self and a non-sexual self. This starts right after birth, when her earliest caretaker, usually her mother or the mothering figure, does not celebrate the little girl's sex as much as a little boy's. That's not the case all the time, but it's often the case. Because mother-daughter is not the relationship with the little girl is not celebrated as much, because the mother-daughter relationship is not a polarized relationship. It's a same-sex relationship. The mother tends not to celebrate it as much. And then there's also all of the societal influences that I just spoke about, the devaluing of the feminine. So the summary on that is that it's, if you're wrapped in a pink blanket when you're born, it's usually not celebrated as much as if you're wrapped in a blue blanket. Later, when the little girl attains greater awareness of her femaleness, biologically and otherwise, she transfers her primary relationship from her mother to her father. So the little girl has a primary relationship with the mothering person, usually the mother, and then the primary relationship transfers to the father. She identifies with the mother, but polarizes with the father. So there's still identification with the mother, but the primary relationship becomes the polarized relationship with the father. That becomes the more important relationship generally. Now, depending on how this new father-daughter polarized relationship is handled, we focused a lot on that during the meditation, the little girl will either regain contact with her sexual self and feminine self, or continue to lose contact with it. So as the relationship transfers from the primary identification with the mother, she's identified with the mother, but has a primary relationship with the mother, becomes a primary relationship with the father, polarized relationship. Depending on how that goes, she's either going to continue to separate away from her femininity, or she's going to sort of regain contact with it if that polarized daughter-father relationship goes well.
Yeah, like there's a woman that I'm working with, and we were talking a couple weeks ago, and she was sharing about how, when she was little, there was her daddy, and they had this beautiful, loving relationship. They still do. But what she noticed as she was starting to come more into being an older little girl, and then even older and coming into more of puberty time and everything, there was an increasing awkward feeling between her and her father. Her father was a little awkward around her femininity, and then that impacted her in her future romantic relationships. So she's just starting to see that now, why things are going the way that they're going in her romantic relationships.
And classically, those are called Oedipal issues, right? Oedipal or Electra issues. I won't get into why, but those are classically what they're called. And if the Oedipal issues, basically the fears involved in a father-daughter polarized relationship, for a little boy it would be a son-mother relationship or mother-son relationship, or we're focusing on female sexual psychology or feminine sexual psychology now. So if the Oedipal issues, the father-daughter issues, are well handled, in other words, her femaleness is celebrated but not exploited, then she'll have greater contact with those feminine qualities, especially the kind of younger feminine qualities. They're not really quite sexual the way we normally think of sexuality. Freud talked about the sexuality of children. It's not really an adult sexuality, obviously. The girl hasn't gone through puberty, but it is a femininity. There is a sort of a pre-sexuality there. So if that father-daughter relationship is handled well, celebrated but not exploited, then she'll have greater contact with the young aspects of her sexuality, and later, her full female sexuality.
I love how you just said that, because it's this aspect of ourselves that develops in reflection with others. I mean, really, you could say that for all the aspects of becoming a person, right? Or we look to be reflected by the people that are raising us. But particularly our sexuality, it doesn't just grow on its own in a vacuum. It grows in relationship and reflection with the people raising us.
And a great deal of our focus in this class in Master of Relationship is obviously romantic relationship, and people often neglect to look at how did their earliest polarized relationships go, and especially with their opposite sex parent or same-sex parent if they're gay, right? So it's it's kind of an obvious place to look, but people often don't look there. So we're inviting you, as we're delivering this topic, as we did in the meditation, to really look there. What feelings are evoked? What thoughts come to mind? What memories? What intuitions? You don't need to remember it all exactly. Most people don't, but you can probably get a sense of, was there exploitation, or was it more kind of in that awkward, repressed category, which is more commonly the case. Because children's first sexually polarized relationship is with the parent of the opposite sex, of the opposite gender, Oedipal prohibitions, right? Don't feel that because it's a parent, right? It's not really a sexuality exactly normally the way we think of it, but it is a polarized relationship. And that the child, Oedipal prohibitions are basically the child feeling guilty or wrong about feeling some light flirtatiousness or the difference or the there is a kind of charge in that relationship because it's a different sex relationship, or if it's a same-sex parent, there is that kind of charge, and the child can have Oedipal prohibitions. Ooh, I can't feel that. I shouldn't feel that. Those Oedipal prohibitions, or that feeling wrong about turn-on tumescence sexuality, can be carried forward into the present. They are they are an unconscious avoidance. These Oedipal prohibitions are an unconscious avoidance of polarized sexual relationships, because earlier parental relationship with the parent, are carried into the present. It feels wrong to feel that way with a parent, or it feels wrong just to feel that way, so that repression is carried forward. Then one experiences the prohibitions that one did with one's parent, but it's unconscious. I was just working with a couple yesterday, actually, and they were talking about, how, as their relationship progressed, they just started feeling awkward about sex, and kind of like it wasn't okay, and the turn-on died down. And this is a great part of why that is, and why that happens for people, and why the honeymoon period ends. Because in the beginning, the relationship blueprint isn't so much there. They're new, you feel really new about them, but after a while, the relationship blueprint, which includes Oedipal prohibitions, gets carried in to the relationship, starts to dominate, and people start to feel like, ooh, it's not okay to be turned on, even though it's their romantic partner, and it's usually unconscious.
Yes, and then that can also, for those of you who have kids, that can also increase more when kids come, because then there's even more of a family unit, and then you kind of, it reminds you of your family unit and sort of this familial situation. So those unconscious pieces of conditioning that we picked up in our family system kind of come through into that situation. It's one of the deeper reasons why couples after having kids find themselves having more challenge being attracted to each other, because that unconscious material is coming up. So although on the surface it can be like, well, we're tired and new schedules and all those very valid reasons, there's deeper things going on too.
Yeah, sex and family, it just kind of, people feel really, it doesn't go together, right? But it's interesting because, in pornography, that's the number one theme, actually. In pornography nowadays. It's interesting because something that's been repressed is kind of bursting out, typically in an unhealthy way when it's in pornography. But what happens really is that the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, because, of course, sex and family, there's a way they shouldn't go together, obviously. But the gender differences, it's important that those are celebrated. So often what happens is that sexuality gets thrown out, and then gender differences and acknowledgement of, oh, my beautiful little girl, or, my little boy, you're so strong, the celebration of the gender gets thrown out, and a person sort of loses contact with that, whether they're straight or gay or however that goes. There's just this kind of gender confusion, or gender amorphousness, or non-genderness, and that, that creates a type of non-sexuality later that's very repressed, or bursts out in unhealthy ways, which you can see in a lot of pornography, or you can see in different types of dysfunctional sexual relationships, perversions, that kind of thing. But the most common is the repression. Now, all this growing and developing happens, social influences continue. For the little girl, personal experiences with boys in puberty tend to deepen the split. Teenage boys are really not that great at interacting with teenage girls on average.
Thank you for saying that. A little part of me is healed.
Right. It kind of widens that split. For girls between the sexual self and the non-sexual self. So, in summary, ambivalence is formed towards her sexuality. So the real questions are, how did those relationships, right, the earlier polarized relationship with the parents and so on, or parents, go for the little girl, the later relationships in puberty, how did they go?
Yeah, and as we're talking about this and kind of offering up these inquiries, consider these things for yourself. If you are a woman listening to this, or a feminine identified person, how did this go for you? If you're masculine identified or a man, you may contemplate like, wow, you may have sisters, you may think of girls and women and let all of this kind of like, how does this relate to you? How did this go for you?
So good questions to ask are, how was, if you're a woman or identify as feminine, how was your primary relationship with your mother, and how did it transfer to the polarized relationship with the father? How did that go? How did that transfer go into a polarized relationship? Was it smooth? Was it not smooth? Was that polarized relationship positive and celebrated? Or was the sexuality or the pre-sexuality, the gender celebration buried, repressed? Or was it exploited, right? That's not commonly the case, but it's, sometimes it is the case. And it's tragic when it is, and it can obviously go very badly if that's the case. Also, how did cultural norms affect you? How did later sexual relationships, especially in puberty, affect you? So, a woman is left in either a virtuous circle of feminine wholeness and sexuality, or a vicious circle of division within herself, manifesting in an inhibited relationship with her sexuality and her sexual partners, or an exaggerated kind of grasping relationship with sexual partners, or both. That's not uncommon either, kind of a avoidance and attachment. When there are difficulties in the primary mother relationship with the mother, and later polarized father relationship, residues of inhibiting and painful relationships, emotions, sensations, all of that remain, and current circumstances activate or trigger those early parts of the relationship blueprint. So current circumstances trigger that stuff. So maybe, somebody just being sexual, like, triggers something, and there's a grabbing or an avoidance or anger or upset or a need to repress something. And, sexuality is one of the biggest triggers for people. Notice that if you're turned on to somebody, is that easy and flowing and smooth, or, does it get awkward and uncomfortable, or do you dissociate from it, or, what happens there? It tends to trigger patterns, and the earliest patterns reappear as if from nowhere. But actually, they're coming from the unconscious, right? So tonight's topic is a deep dive into the unconscious, into this very sensitive material, so that when these patterns appear, you know where they're coming from, and you can inquire and sort of excavate that material. So it's in your consciousness, and it can heal and ultimately dissolve, and you can have a present relationship based in reality. A further point that we should stress is that the very nature of feminine turn-on is so powerful in its effect on the feminine person and the masculine person that things can feel very out of control. If she is not in agreement with her female sexual power, she's bound to repress that part of herself out of fear of it.
Yes, the most kind of striking example of that is like the Victorian woman, with the clothing up to here and all the way down here, and very kind of proper unexpressed. That's the repression of this wild sexuality.
And of course we know about parts of the world where women have to cover themselves. They don't even have a choice about that. Or, I hate to say it, but even where the primary sex organ of a woman, her clitoris, is amputated, right? Mm-hmm. To get rid of that because it's so, so triggering because of all the issues we've discussed. So trust is required, a willingness to be out of control and trust sexuality and life and consciousness and so on. Now, women or the feminine person does this more than men because the appetite or that energy or tumescence or sexual energy starts in her body. Right? You always hear me using that example of the female lion goes into heat. It starts in her body and then the male lion responds to that. To get away from that energy, she has to repress it very strongly. If she's, if there's that mistrust, then the repression has to be very strong. She is at effect of that appetite because in a very strong way because it originates in her body. And in such a control-oriented culture, being out of control is frowned upon. The culture is very, we live in a culture that's very control-oriented. So being out of control and released is really frowned upon.
Yes, which is, that's the situation that the feminine is in, having this very natural, wild, released, out of controlness is the natural flow of ourselves. But then the culture and the conditioning says no, no, no. So we're kind of like, inside of ourselves, hence that split. You can't completely get rid of it, but you could really repress it. And that's the situation that the feminine is in.
It's one of the amazing things about Alicia. She does demonstrations of extended orgasm, right? I'm doing this. How hard is this? She's coming in front of, sometimes up to 100 people, right? That's an agreement with being out of control, trusting me, trusting herself, trusting life, but really trusting sexuality, not in an unconscious way, right? Trust is not being unconscious and doing things haphazardly, but it's an openness to that. For example, in terms of the culture of control, for example, it's culturally better to be the person fucking the other person, if you excuse me for speaking that way, than the person being fucked, right? Fucking somebody's okay, being fucked is not. Control and command is valued. In bed, this is not usually what the feminine person desires, right? Usually she's more interested in being at effect, being out of control, but then of course there's that ambivalence about that. So again, the split, which is the theme of tonight's topic on female sexual psychology, the split is reinforced by not embracing that sexual energy and the possible release of control. So that's probably a good place to end it. I'll say a couple of words about extended full body orgasm. Extended full body orgasm, I mentioned, Alicia's mastered that, which doesn't mean it doesn't get better and better for her. It does, but at will, her will or my will, actually, she's that surrendered. She can have that experience. Extended full body orgasm is a good indicator of wholeness and inclusion of the sexual self, since it requires openness of body, emotion, mind, and the fourth center, or the sexual center.
Yes, and this is why learning to receive extended orgasm is so powerful. Those of you who have studied it with us, to whatever degree you have, some of you are about to, it's so powerful, not just because of the actual physical pleasure, but because it unifies all parts of us. Our mind completely let go and our hearts open, and the trust and full feeling in our bodies, all the way out through our fingertips and our toes. And then, of course, the physical, sexual, sensual pleasure, just that unification of the whole being. Awesome. Yeah, and the nice thing about exploring all of this together, as a school and as a community and here in Mastery of Relationship, is that there's space for all of it. For most of us, it did not go perfectly. There were many challenges for some of us not as much. And so wherever you are at right now, whatever you're feeling, whatever has come up for you during this whole evening, see if you can just allow space for it. That's what we are here to provide, is the space. You can reach out to us for support. We're all here together, doing this together.